Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Hey, Mike, today's guest on the podcast is Peter Lawrence. He purchased a new to him 2005 Beneteau 473 sailboat. Very nice sailboat. I looked at those when we were thinking about buying a boat, and it was on our list. It's a great looking boat, very nice boat. And he purchased it in Racine, Wisconsin, but he lives in Rochester, New York. So he ended up sailing it approximately 800 miles from Racine all the way to Rochester, which means you're going across 4 of the Great Lakes, the St. Clair Canal, the Detroit River, and something called the Welland Canal. And he did all of that in 11 days. So I thought that was sort of an interesting experience that our listeners would like to hear about. And let me give folks a quick update on Paradox, our boat, our Hunter 45 Dexalon. So we're recording this on November 7th, and Paradox is now on the hard, as they say, means it's out of the water. I've not seen her out of the water yet, so I'm not sure if we're going to need bottom paint. But I usually get 2 seasons out of the bottom paint. And the bottom paint is sort of like an ablative paint, Mike. So it sort of wears off as time goes on. It's not like paint on your house.
Right. By design, right?
By design. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's by design. That's how it keeps itself clean. And so a quick tip for folks, several years ago, when we blasted the bottom of the boat and took everything down to gel coat and then put on, because it had numerous layers of bottom paint on it. And then we put on an epoxy barrier coat, and then we put on 3 coats of bottom paint, anti-fouling paint. And what we did is the very first coat, we made one color. And then the other 2 coats, we made it the same, but different colors from the first coat. So we had like a red on the bottom, and then we had 2 layers of black. So when the boat gets hauled, if I'm starting to see red at places on the hull, then I know that I need new bottom paint.
You're on the last coat.
I'm on my last coat. Right.
Cool.
So it wasn't my idea. This was something that folks at the marina said, hey.
Right, but it's cool. Right. It's totally
clever.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Right. It's very clever. So that's just a quick tip for everybody. So I still need to go out and put the cover on the boat and remove a few more things, but the boat's pretty much ready for the winter. So yeah, that's where we're at.
Yeah, the change of seasons in the Northeast U.S. is a little bittersweet, isn't it, Bela? You know,
yeah.
End of another sailing season, and sometimes the winters are pretty long up there. I remember from living there, and you're anticipating spring to arrive, and when you can get that boat back in the water. But I'm glad you made it through another what sounded to me like a really great sailing season with your family. Had some great trips, some great weather, great experiences. But I guess, getting back to today's guest, speaking of sailing stories, I'm really interested to hear. This is one of our longtime listeners, Peter Lawrence, and as you mentioned, he lives in Rochester, New York, which is a little bit west of our normal East Coast kind of focus. But the Great Lakes, are near to my heart. And I was born in Detroit and raised in Michigan. And a little known fact that probably I told you once, but my first sailing experience back in the 1980s was doing a overnight crossing of Lake Huron and then sailing up around Tobermory and the islands in Lake Huron on the Ontario side. So I've got a little bit of history here.
Yeah, and this is sort of starting in on your home stomping grounds, as they say. And the Great Lakes there's some really good sailing there. So I thought it would really be good for our listeners and especially of interest to you. So let's get right into my discussion with Peter. Hello, Peter. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Bela. It's a great pleasure to be on the podcast. I enjoy the format that you and Mike have come up with, and excited to be here.
Well, thank you very much. This is another podcast that's a great example of one of our listeners reaching out to us and dropping us an email. And that email conversation led to having that person on the podcast. So thank you so much for doing that, Peter.
No problem, Mike. or Bela, great
Yeah.
to be here.
Yep. Excellent. So, where are you right now geographically?
So right now I'm located in Rochester, New York, which is kind of central Lake Ontario on the New York State side, and been here for years. Boating career started with a aluminum outboard boat shortly after high school. Went in the service, kind of got away from boating, got back into power boating, probably 2010. Had that for a couple years, a couple Cobalt power boats, which I enjoyed. Finished up my last degree at the University of Rochester, and my wife said, "All right, you need to get another hobby. You've got too many degrees. Come up with something else." And a good friend of mine said, "Let's do a bareboat charter." And I had no clue what that was, and he told me, and I said, "Let's go for it." And that started my learning in sailboats, which was probably about 2014, so just about 10 years now.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. It is amazing how people who get invited to onto another person's sailboat, or they go on a bareboat charter with someone, maybe with a captain or someone who's experienced, a friend of theirs who's experienced, and how that ignites this sort of, hey, this is really cool. And they sort of dive into it. Some wade into the pool cautiously and carefully, and others dive into the pool head first. So either worked.
Yeah, after doing the bareboat charter, I knew that sailboat was, in my future. As a matter of fact, I told my wife when I came back, I'm like, "We're gonna get a sailboat," and she's like, "Yeah, but you can't sell the power boat." And I'm like, "Okay." So I decided, which I was going to sell the boat, but I sold the power boat and bought her a new pickup truck instead. So that eased the transition, and my wife's been into the sailboat ever since.
Oh, that's excellent. Excellent. So what's been your progression in sailboats?
Sure. So the first boat I bought was a Tartan 31, which was a great sailboat. I used to be a mechanic by trade, so I have I guess it'll be an illness. I'd say an affliction, but an illness. When something's wrong, I fix it. So whoever buys one of my boats generally has done very well for themselves because I start at one end and go through the other end. Had the Tartan 31 for 3 years. Ended up going through that pretty thoroughly. Decided I wanted a Bristol Channel cutter, 28 foot, which is about 38 foot overall with the bowsprit and boomkin. I bought a great boat with a great pedigree. It had sailed with Lynn and Larry Pardee. Just a very solid high-end boat. Figuring that I wouldn't have to do much. Well, lo and behold, I decided that I wanted to repower it, new chain plates, rebuild the ports, redo the bottom, uh, add a staysail furler, replace the other furler. So after about 3 years of that, we were out cruising, and my wife said, I like this, but I'd like to have a full shower and room to entertain people. So I said, "No problem, we'll sell the boat." And she's like, "No, don't sell the boat on my account, but it would be nice to have the ability to entertain people." So I
Yeah.
put the boat up for sale. Um, Found a gentleman who had a Bristol Channel cutter who wanted one. He had sold his other one years back. Knew the boat, so that was relatively painless sale. Went on the hunt for a bigger boat. Ended up finding a Beneteau 473, so 47 foot, two cabin boat with generator, air conditioners, all the bells and whistles you could want, oversized winches, um, Great Lakes freshwater boat, which is nice. But like any boat, there's always maintenance that needs to be done. And that boat was in Racine, Wisconsin.
Yeah. So that's a very nice boat. I remember that boat was on our list of boats to consider when we were looking around. Very spacious, if I remember, down below, and really, really nice layout and stuff. Very nice.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a very bright, there's a lot of windows and shade, so you can make it dark, but it's also and very tall. I think it's over 6'4" at most of the interior headroom.
Yeah, yeah. So your Bristol Channel cutter, where did you sail that?
So that was just on Lake Ontario. I didn't
Okay.
get a chance to really go anywhere with it. It was rebuild and intentions to take it down to the Bahamas. But it just I'll say it's a younger person's boat or someone that has always wanted one because it's not as comfortable as the newer models.
Yeah. Yes. When we bought our boat, we had a couple of requirements, and I'm 70 now. My wife is 70, so we don't want to be crawling over each other to get in and out of bed.
Yeah.
We don't want to be crawling up over the lifelines to get on and off the boat. So, we had to have a first of all headroom, a nice shower, a nice head, a nice dining area, a nice kitchen. We wanted an RV that floats. I mean, if you want to be really honest about it, and because that's what meets our needs, and that's very different. And one of the great things I think about sailboats, even more so than automobiles, it's interesting. You look at an automobile now these days. If you look at an SUV and you line up 10 different manufacturers of SUVs, and they're 100 feet away from you, they all look alike.
Right.
I mean, it's like maybe one's a little bit bigger, one's a little smaller, but they all look identical. And that's not true about boats. You line up 10 boats and they come in all sizes and shapes and layouts. And so there's always something there for that meets your needs, whatever they may be. And I think that's one of the great things about boating is there is this wide spectrum of offerings, so that whatever your quirkiness is that you have to have, you can find it.
Well, you bring up a great point, Bela. With boats, there's so many different types, and it's really critical when you buy a boat to think about what do you really want to accomplish, because otherwise, the Tartan was a great boat. It had cruising potential, but I had the intentions like, geez, I'd like to cross oceans, or I'd like to go down to the Bahamas. And of course, as life plans change a little bit, I had to narrow down and say, all right, could I cross an ocean? Possibly, maybe the Atlantic. But really, I've got to focus on a boat that I can cruise the Great Lakes, I can take down the ICW, I can get to the Bahamas, and if it goes further, great. But I don't need a true blue water heavy cruiser that won't sail so well on the Great Lakes, depending on our wind conditions, which can be fluky,
Yeah.
but also challenging. Yeah.
So you bought this boat in Racine, Wisconsin, and you're in Rochester, New York, not Minnesota. Yep. I have a funny story about Rochester, Minnesota. I once, when I was working, I said to my assistant, "Hey, I need to go to Rochester," and I was in California at the time, and so I got next, and I just used to do that. I need to go to Rochester for 2 days, set it up for me, and I get my tickets, and it's to go to Rochester, New York. I wanted to go to Rochester, Minnesota, which is where the Mayo Clinic is, right? So it was like, oh, I didn't even realize there was two. She goes, I didn't realize there was two Rochesters. I go, yep, there is. So anyway, so Racine, if I remember my geography correctly, is just south of Milwaukee, sort of between Milwaukee and Chicago.
Correct. Yep. It's about 30 miles south of Milwaukee. And as a matter of fact, when we ended up going, we were thinking, what's the best way to start our journey? And Milwaukee was our first kind of little shakedown point, which worked out good.
Yeah. So, as the crow flies from Racine to Rochester is, I don't know, several hundred miles, but as the boat goes, it's a lot further because you're in Lake Michigan. I think then you have to head north, if I remember correctly from my geography, all the way up like to Mackinac City, is it? I think.
Correct.
And then down Lake Huron.
Huron, yeah.
And then you got to go through some land, in essence, through some canals, I think, or something like that, into Lake Erie, and then go the whole length of Lake Erie, and again through some canals in Buffalo and Niagara Falls there into Lake Ontario. So you're basically going almost transversing all of the Great Lakes.
Yeah, we hit 4 out of the 5, which
Yeah.
was good. We didn't hit Superior, although that's close up at the top. It was a great experience. One of the things that I would share with the listeners, should they choose to go and traverse the Great Lakes, there's the Great Lakes Cruising Club, which is phenomenal to join. They have harbor reports for every lake, so every Great Lake, and they'll provide you detailed pictures, where to go, and even more importantly, there's port captains. And I fortunately lucked out with a port captain from Milwaukee, Jim Caraway, who was instrumental, very salty sailor, now power boater. But Jim had been sailing in, the 60s, and just great asking questions. What about this? What about that? Have you thought of this? What are your bailout points? So it was just a great resource along the way, which that group will give you, as well as the America's Great Loop
Yes.
Cruising Association. They have great resources as well for a trip similar to this.
Yeah. Yeah. Other than doing a day sail once with a friend of mine from Rochester and kind of sailing, halfway across the lake and back, I've never sailed there. I've just been up and down the East Coast, basically, of the United States. And one of the nice things about sailing the coast of the United States, East Coast, is that there's a lot of bailout points. Probably 50 miles is the furthest that you have to go to get a bailout point. You can pull into some harbor someplace through some inlet. And is that also true like in the Great Lakes? Because I'm just not familiar with the sort of shoreline, if you will, the various Great Lakes.
Sure. So Lake Michigan is, really, I think, hats off to, Lake Michigan, both Michigan and Wisconsin. Every 20 to 30 miles, there's a harbor of refuge or a point, because that can be really a short fetch in high seas. A guy I worked for the Coast Guard, and he says, if it comes from the north, you can get 17 to 20 foot waves on there with short fetch, which I was hoping to avoid, which we did. But that was always in my mind. Lake Huron, it's a little more stretched out. Erie, we were primarily went the Canadian side, but we ended up really taking the route almost like a delivery because of people's time constraints. I had 2 retirees and 3 people that were working and kind of had schedules, so trying to coordinate that. But Lake Ontario, there's parts, but there's not a lot of areas where you can bail out depending on where you're going. You might be, 40 miles or 35 miles or more, depending on where you are.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I once remember someone once describing, I think it was Lake Ontario, the shoreline is sort of like a bathtub. There's like very few places to sort of pull in and stop. So on your trip here, so how big was your crew?
So we had myself, had my first mate, Kim, Hans, who was a second mate, Bob, and Anthony, and myself.
Okay.
So a total of 5. And then Kim had hopped off at Detroit. She had to do a paying gig.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it worked out well.
And was this kind of your first long passage that you've done?
So I've done passages with others. It was the first on my own boat, but I've gone from St. Martin to Huntington, New York, from Annapolis or Huntington down to Annapolis,
Oh, okay, nice.
Annapolis down to South Carolina. So I've done some offshore work in ICW, but this was the first where, okay, it's your boat, you're in charge, you're the captain. But it was nice to have Kim. She has done a bunch of charter work as well, so that helped with
Yeah.
the confidence.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I've been the same. I've done a fair number of trips, passages on other people's boats, and I've done a few on my boat. And when I'm on someone else's boat, if I have confidence in the captain, which every time I did it, I did have confidence in the captain. Boy, I'm really relaxed. I'm not sort of thinking about much. I'm just really enjoying the experience. And when you're the captain, for at least for me, I feel this much higher level of burden, or not burden, responsibility.
Sure.
I'm thinking about, okay, what are our bailout points? Where can we go? If this happens, what are we going to do? What happens if the storm blows up? Where are we going to go? And worried about weather, and I'm concentrating on all those things. So was it the same for you?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that I really did ahead of time was come up with checklists. And there again, I was fortunate with the America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. They've got about 29 different checklists. So I created checklists specifically for the trip, radio procedures, person overboard, fog and restricted visibility. So just things that way, came up with a booklet with all different things specific to our boat. That way,
Mhm.
if someone had to call in a security or a mayday, there's the script, and it's not like insert this, it's already in there.
Yeah.
So that kind of gave me a little bit of comfort, but yeah, it's a big responsibility taking others out on the Great Lakes. And then also when we went in the beginning of May. The water temperature was 50 degrees, which, 50 degrees, you're not going to survive long if someone goes overboard, and let alone, the ability to find someone. So that definitely weighed on my mind as, we need to
Sure.
keep everyone on board. We need to stay clipped in if we go forward. Safety has got to be paramount.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the safety equipment you had on board and what sort of your safety procedures were.
Sure. So one of the things, we had a life raft, which some people might say, well, you're on the Great Lakes, it's not that far. 50 degrees of water, you're going to want to get out, and you'll be lucky if you could climb into the life raft. So a friend of mine was kind enough to let me borrow a life raft. We had jack lines from bow to stern, multiple tethers, so everyone had a tether. The other thing that I like to do, which I think is critical and I recommend of everyone, carry a portable two-way radio on their person, especially when they're on watch. So I've got 4 different two-ways. Always keep one in the cockpit, but if someone goes forward or if someone's on a night watch, if they have that on them, should they become separated from the boat, they can call. Where if not, especially at night, your chances of survivability are greatly diminished, even if someone's aware that you fell off.
Right. Right. Yeah. And the good news is many of those little portable marine radios are waterproof. So I think everyone you buy these days is waterproof. And so that means you can use it just like you said.
Yeah, and even I got a new one. It's I think it's a standard Horizon, like an HX50, but very small. So I mean, it's, almost the size of a cell phone, a little smaller. So it clips on. You don't feel this big bulky
Yeah.
two-way on your hip. But yeah, it's definitely a good thing. I also keep on my own PFD. personal locator beacon as well as a personal AIS. So
Yeah.
should I become detached, the crew can find me.
Yeah. And what was your sort of policy? I'm always interested in what sort of your rules are or policy is for wearing life jackets.
So at night, everyone has to have the PFD on in the cockpit, and also we'd say clip in. It's not
Okay.
that much inconvenience. You're not going anywhere anyways. The other thing that was nice, the boat came with a full enclosure. So
Oh,
you've
okay.
got, vinyl all the way around and screens when we made the passage. So that helps kind of feel that you're a little more secure, but we just keep clipped in. During the daytime, I kind of left it a little bit looser, but if weather gets bad, definitely people need to be clipped in.
Yeah. And on my boat, I have I think 6 of those inflatable PFDs. I think 2 came with the boat, and then I bought 4 of them. And my rule on the boat is if you're on the boat and we're away from the dock, you got to wear a PFD.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
I find those inflatable ones, no one complains about them.
Yeah.
And what kind of, do you have inflatable ones, or did you have the different types?
Yeah, no. So most people brought their inflatable ones. I've got the offshore inflatables, which are a little heavier,
Yes.
but still very comfortable. Like you say, no one will complain about those. My personal one, I've got, it's a Team O, which is from Europe, which will back tow you. So if you got um, pulled overboard and you're tethered, it will pull you
Yes.
behind. But the only issue with that is it's heavy. So
Yeah.
it's a offshore thing. So usually if I'm cruising myself and whenever I single-handed sail, I definitely have the PFD on as well as the two-way radio.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. The 4 of the 2 that came with the boat don't have built-in harnesses, but the 4 I bought all have built-in harnesses.
Yeah.
So you can, you don't have to have a separate harness if you need to clip in. Very good. So what type of equipment do you have on the boat? I mean, AIS, radar.
Sure. Yeah. So got AIS Class B, so that transmits our position. We have radar, which is a Doppler Quantum 2, which is a phenomenal piece of equipment because between that and the chart plotter, we ran into fog from Lake Erie and then through the Welland Canal, and Lake Ontario was just pea soup fog. Um, Myself, I'm comfortable with it, but I worry about the fishing boats that have no
Right.
radar. Sometimes the lights, you can't see them. They're very low powered. With the radar, you can literally see day marks. You can see aids to navigation. You can pick up fishing boats. And when you see a target, you can click on it and you acquire the target. It'll put a circle around it. And depending on the speed and the direction, if it's heading towards you, it'll turn red. If it's
Oh,
going
wow.
the other direction, or it's facing away from you, it'll be green. So that's nice. We use that a lot, especially on Lake Ontario, where it was so thick and you'd see boats literally spinning because they couldn't get their reference point. Even with the chart plotter, sometimes that GPS takes a little bit to
Yes.
catch up with where you are if you're spinning quickly in a powerboat.
Yeah. Well, that's a really nice feature on radar. I mean, it's almost, I mean, I encounter a fair number of boats, particularly fishing boats, that don't have AIS or they don't have it turned on.
Yeah.
So, and if you're out at night, I always have a hard time. I mean, I try to, memorize all the light stuff, but still I have a hard time. Is that coming towards me or is it going away from me? And that's a really nice feature in that radar. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, and the other thing with the radar is people need to practice when there's, daylight, when the weather's good. One of the things that we could easily see, and we were testing, what does the shore look like from what we see compared to what's displayed? The newer radars and chart plotters can split the screen, so you can have your chart plotter displaying on one half and then the radar, and usually it should match. And it
Right.
was it was interesting when we were coming into the port of Rochester. For some reason, something was off, and I did an overlay, and I'm looking, going, wait a second, these two aren't matching. They'd matched the whole time, and we had even checked to one of the things that the port captain had said to me. He said, check your position when you're at the dock. He said, bring up your chart plotter, look at it. He says, then pull up GPS to see with the satellite image where you are and compare those two. So we did that in Frankfurt, and it was spot on. But when we got to the port of Rochester, the jetty that we were going through, if we were going by night or without radar, it could have been an issue.
Yeah.
So they're great to have, but you need to use them and be able to interpret them.
And I think the other sentence I'll add to that is you can't let yourself be 100% dependent on electronics.
Yeah. So that's a great point. And a lot of people get, and I'm a tech guy, I like technology, but you got to use your senses. You got to make sure you're looking around, listening, that you got a good lookout. But I tell you what, when it is pea soup fog, you are going to drive by instruments because you just you can't see. We've
Right.
got a couple of photos that are just amazing. It's like you can't see 10 feet off of the bow of the boat.
Yeah. 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 It certainly makes going out in those conditions possible.
Correct. Yeah. And feeling at least semi-safe, that you can have an idea what's coming up. The other thing that's interesting, the new radars are so sensitive. When we were pulling into the port or the jetty in Rochester, believe it or not, I mean, it was treacherous conditions. There's 5 jet skis. I can't see them, but I hear them. And then all of a sudden they're coming into the river. So I give, 3 blasts. You should give 5 blasts, but I just gave 3 blasts to let them know. All of a sudden you can hear them slow down. And as we're going through the river, I was able to pick them up as a target behind me as red.
Wow.
And, jet skis is primarily fiberglass. There's not a lot of metal target there.
Yeah. And they're low to the water. I mean, they're
Yeah.
barely out of the water.
Yeah. So it's amazing, the technology.
Yeah, that is impressive. Very impressive. So did you guys do overnight passages, or were these pretty much day sails?
Yeah. So we ended up doing 2 overnight passages. And there again, it was important. One of the lessons that I took away, and this was a great conversation with Jim Caraway, is initially we were looking and trying to like schedule out where do we want to be by when. We wanted to make sure Kim was able to get to the airport in Detroit by a certain day. And we were like, well, if we do the night passage, we can go through this area at night up to the Straits of Mackinac, and then we can hit that in the morning. And when I mentioned it to Jim, Jim's like, whoa, 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 you don't want to go through there. If you get bad weather, we had solar flares, a lot going on that could have disrupted GPS. He's like, you don't want to go through there at night, or if bad weather, or if the light blows out on one of the shoals. So it really got me thinking, like, all right, wait a second, I really need to plan a little better for not only the bailouts, which I was looking at, but where do you want to cross tight or difficult spots? You want to do that during the daytime. So our first night passage, we actually ended up going through, we left early in the morning to pass these shoals and Gray's Reef, and then straight to Mackinac, and then we did a night passage on Lake Huron, and we ended up at the Lake St. Clair River on our way to Detroit in the morning.
Right.
So
Right.
and that was just a critical thing of planning that I really didn't think about. Of course, now it's like duh, but it's one of those things you really need to look at with your chart plotter. That's another thing. I ended up having charts paper charts and chart books for the whole trip. So that makes it a lot easier. People that are planning a passage, you really need to rely on the paper if you can get it, because you see things when you're looking on, even if you've got a 9-inch chart plotter, which is a pretty good size, to zoom in and zoom out to see hazards, it's not as easy as looking at a paper chart or a chartlet.
Yeah, amen. I'm with you on that. I have chart books, those big, poster size chart books that I have, because I'm with you. It gives you the whole picture, and just zooming in and zooming out on my GPS, just my chart plotter just doesn't do it for me. It doesn't give me that same richness of information and data, or at least my brain doesn't know how to process it if it's there, right? But if I look at a big piece of paper, and it's really helpful for me.
Yeah, if you're day sailing in your local area, or you're going across the lake, I mean, it's not that big a deal. But when you are going on a passage of a couple lakes or a good distance that you're not familiar with, and there's shoaling or there's some
Right.
areas, I mean, it is just so helpful to visually be able to see that without zooming in and zooming out.
Yeah, and so the zooming in and zooming out is, I think, what confuses my brain, right? When I'm looking at a piece of paper, the scale, the zoom doesn't change. The scale remains the same.
Mm-hmm.
So my brain gets calibrated to, okay, this is a narrow spot. This is not a narrow spot. But if I'm on a small chart plotter and I'm zooming in, that could be a narrow spot, but it doesn't look very narrow because I'm zoomed in so much.
Yeah, it's
So it tricks my brain.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very good. So I'm always curious, when people do night passages, how did you do your watches?
So great question. One of the things that we looked at, so myself and my first mate, Kim, is, all right, let's look at the strengths, the sailing strengths and seamanship strengths of the crew. So we ended up pairing um, two of the people with the least amount experience with myself and Kim. So, to help teach. And then the person that we were fortunate at the time, who was like a second mate, he did a split. So he would be an hour with me, an hour with her, and we rotated through. That worked out well, but really making sure that you plan your watches and who's responsible is pretty critical.
And what were the shifts? What were the length of the shifts?
So the shifts on that, we were 2 hour shifts. Were we 2 hours? 3 hour shifts. 3 hour shifts. And that ended up working out pretty well with us, especially because we would do a full night watch and then we would end up staying overnight at a marina, and then we did another one. But we only really had to do it twice.
Okay.
So, but I
And
do enjoy the night traveling, the night watches, and actually I like to have by myself, because as a captain you can really listen to the boat, you can think and process what's going right, what's going wrong, rather than
yeah,
getting involved with a conversation, which is good, but
right. To me, there's something magical about sitting in the cockpit at 2 a.m, and you're sailing, the boat's just behaving very nicely, everything is nice, the stars are out, maybe there's a moon. To me, there's just something magical about that time, particularly when you're alone. It's just, I can't, that's the only way I can describe it, as magical.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So did you also like schedule watches during the day? So there was always somebody sort of in command, if so to speak, and responsible?
So we ended up doing that a little bit looser. There was myself and Kim, and then when Kim hopped off, Hans became first mate. As long as, one of the things that I, encouraged everyone is, if you're at all tired, go lay down. So we had people regularly taking naps. Even myself as the captain, if it looked like everyone's wide awake, I'm going down below. I'm going to, rest my eyes, take a little bit of a nap, and always tell them, look, if you've got any questions, by all means, wake me up. There's no dumb question. Something doesn't sound right, smell right, feel right. It's a new noise. Wake me up. I'll sleep much better knowing that, you guys are going to call on me. And they did a great job with that.
Yeah, that's a great point about taking naps. For people who listen to this podcast, know that I've told a couple stories about traveling with Simon and Sawyer, who've been on the podcast numerous times, and they always used to make fun of me because if I wasn't on duty, I'd go down below and take a nap. And part of my philosophy is you never know. And we were doing 3-4 day passages, so we had a schedule. So it was always, and there was 3 of us, so it was 3 hours on, 6 hours off, 24 hours a day. And so I would always catch a cat nap whenever I could. And my philosophy was, number one, I want to be rested, because when you're not rested, you make crappy decisions. And number two, you never know when you have to stay awake for the next 10 hours.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, right? You never know. So I don't want to, if I have the opportunity to rest, I'm going to go take it. And I just think that's something that we oftentimes don't think about, the implications of not being rested.
Yeah, no, it's critical. And even especially when you're starting, whether it's a journey or a trip, everyone's all excited. Or if it's a night race, everyone's excited. And then all of a sudden, 11, 12 o'clock, everyone's like, oh, it's getting tired. It's like, no, you need to plan for that. And as a captain, you've got to be, on your game. You can't say, all right, I got to make a decision, and it's a pressure decision, and I'm overtired.
Right. Very good. Very good. Let's see. What else should we chat about that I haven't asked you?
Yeah, so one of the things that I had a lot of lessons learned or reinforcement with the trip, and one of the things that I knew about going into the trip, especially being a new boat, is every hour you've got to check the engine, you got to check the bilge, you got to make sure that things are working. We even had a temperature gun to shoot at different parts of the engine to see, is this a normal range? And everything was good. Although when we first left Racine to Milwaukee, there was a heater hose on the water heater that we had to replace. And there's a rear bilge that, believe it or not, doesn't necessarily connect up to the main bilge. So we got that all clean and vacuumed out. And as we're going to Milwaukee, there's about 4 to 5 foot waves that were on the nose. We're going pretty good. I was very impressed the boat didn't pound. But all of a sudden, I look and did an engine compartment check, and I'm like, oh my God, by the dripless, there's water. I mean, and there's substantial water. So I'm thinking, my God, are we taking on water? What's going on here? So, monitored it, sucked out the water, and it was fine. It was just excess from so much heaving of the boat and going through the waves. It was fine on the trip. But there again, you need to check for chafe. Is there, while the engine's under load, do you see a hose that's vibrating? If so, pull it apart to make sure it's not wearing against another hose or a piece of metal. We did find one of the hoses had a spot that I didn't see before, and we did replace an 1 1/8-inch hose before we even left that had chafe on it. The other thing that's important is, tracking the engine hours. So the boat wasn't, it was new to me. How much fuel am I going to use? Is the fuel gauge correct? We topped off at the beginning, but, how many RPMs are we doing? How many miles are we covering? That's one of the things that we religiously tracked in the logbook whenever we'd fuel. So that was something that we looked at. The other thing, best feature of the boat that I really like is it has granny bars. Familiar with granny bars by the mast?
By the mast, yeah.
So the best thing of the granny bars, especially I've got a infurling mast similar to you. So you're not at the mast a lot, but you can secure your fuel jerry cans in the granny bars. So
Oh,
so I can put 6 of the vertical jerry cans, 3 on each side, and have that secure where I don't have to worry about a boarding wave ripping out the stanchions and the lifelines. For the trip, we only did 2 jerry cans, and we probably should have done 2 more. When we left, I'd mentioned before, we were in May, where it's the beginning of the season, cold temperatures. Well, as we're making our way up north, we're going and it's still cold. A lot of the marinas weren't open yet. So
oh,
we hit one that was opening the next day, but they had fuel. So we were able to get fuel there. But when we were coming to the Welland Canal, we had just enough fuel to get into Port Colborne. But as I'm calling Port Colborne, there's no answer. And as I look at Google, it shows that they're closed. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got a time to catch the Welland Canal because it's not every day. You got to get your appointment. So I started thinking, am I going to have to truck in fuel? And there again, the port captain, Jim Carraway, was phenomenal because he's like, don't worry, you can truck it in. I've had to do that before if need be. So just get there. They're probably open and it's not, they're just not answering the phone or the radio. And it happened to be their first day of being open. The radio wasn't transmitting or something. She said, I didn't hear you. But they weren't answering the phones. But I was thinking, are we going to go to Buffalo to get fuel and come back? Do we have enough fuel to get there? So knowing your fuel is important. And if you're going early season or, when let's say if a hurricane blew through the area you're going through, are people open? So I think I would have done a better job of checking that ahead of time.
yeah. Yeah, I keep a logbook on my boat and I track my fuel, my engine hours religiously. And so I know exactly how much fuel I burn. And I mean, I have a fuel gauge and I also know the fuel gauge is accurate because I have measured it and I've, figured it out. And when I bought the boat, I didn't have a clue if it was accurate or not. And you can't assume because many of them are not. And I actually had my fuel gauge go bad. It stopped working for a period of time. And, I had to figure out what was going on with it. The other thing I want to say about, your bilge and the water and hoses, it's really important to be observant of what's going on your boat and to check things. And when I was helping Simon and Sawyer bring their boat back from Florida, I remember we were 2 or 3 days into the trip and we're out in the ocean, doing a several day passage. And Simon was pretty religious about checking the bilge on his boat all the time for water. And he went down and we were motoring. There was no wind. It was night and we're motoring. And he goes down and checks the bilge and he comes up and he goes, Bale, the bilge is full of water. I said, uh-oh. So, I went down there and stuck my finger in the water and tasted it and it was fresh water. So I go, okay, it's fresh water.
Yeah.
So it's an internal source, not an external source. So that's good. And so what happened was he didn't have a bilge alarm on his boat. And we left the water pressure pump on the the sink water pressure and stuff, and a hose. It's a brand new boat, not new to him. It's a used boat, but new to him. Mm-hmm. And a hose popped off a sink, so a supply hose and basically the water pump turned on, and since we were running the engine, we couldn't hear the water pump turn on. And basically emptied one of the 2 water tanks into the bilge. Right?
Yeah.
So it's just, again, one of those things that if we would have been sailing, we would have heard the water pump turn on, but we weren't sailing. We had the motor on. And so it's just, again, being observant and sort of having a routine checklist of, particularly when you're going on these passages, I'm going to check this every hour, or who's ever on duty, it's their responsibility to check it every hour. And we had one of those lists, and we had a logbook where we checked the bilge, we checked this, we checked that, things for chafe, et cetera, every hour. And we also would log our position every hour off the GPS. So so it just displays your Latin log, and we just log it every hour. So we sort of knew we never had a reading over an hour old. If we lost our GPS and we had to go to charts or something. So anyway, those are good lessons learned.
Yeah, and we had similar thing with our freshwater pump. There must have been like a small air leak because it would pressurize and then shut off and then so it seemed to cycle more than normal. So one of the things was, if you're making tea or boiling water, turn the pressure pump on and then shut it off. Same thing with the gas. We don't the propane, wanted to make sure that that's off. And when you shut off the switch on the panel, that way it burns out the propane through the lines, just as a safety function. But yeah, that water can be a scary thing on a boat when it's coming in, and it's fortunate you were in the ocean where there's salt water, Great Lakes.
That's right.
Fresh water.
That's right. You can't tell. Oh, I never thought of that.
No, and if you had a dirty bilge, all you get is oil taste. But
oh, I never thought of that. That's right. You're in fresh water. So that's probably the only advantage of being in salt water.
Yeah. Another thing we had happen on the trip, our first night passage, we're going, and we checked the lights before we left, but this was a couple days into the passage, and all of a sudden I'm looking, and the boat's 47 foot long, but the way the lights are, you can see if they're on, you can see a sliver of light. If you look just right, it bounces off the rail, and the port navigation light, I'm like, I don't see red. So at this point, we're going. I mean, I'm not going to go up it when it's dark and I can't see. So, we're being aware, looking at AIS. And when the morning came, I said, all right, I got to go forward. I got to clip in. Let me get my tools, my multimeter. Let me see what's going on. And of course, I first think, well, it's probably a connection, because inside the anchor locker, you can see where someone had did a repair. And so I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to have to cut this. And then I thought, well, I've got a spare, because the previous owner did a great job of having spares. So I went back and I'm looking at the light, and it was a Hella brand, and Hella is a great brand of lights. I thought I'd have to unscrew it, but with the Hella brand, you can squeeze the bottom and the lens comes right off.
Yes.
So what a time saver. And also, if I would have just assumed I had to unscrew, I would have caused myself all sorts of possibilities for dropping nuts that didn't need to. But the bulb was actually, the lead on the back of the bulb was worn, and it just wasn't making contact. If I turned it, an eighth of an inch, it would be on. If I turned it off, so I just replaced the bulb. But there again, thinking about and knowing how your systems work in advance is important, because that can save you time from having to cut into wires to see if you've got power, as opposed to just popping off the light.
Right. Well, I'm blessed, and I'm also cursed at the same time with sort of a curious mind. And I often take things apart just to see how they come apart and how they go back together. And sometimes that causes me some grief because I can't figure out how to put it back together, or something breaks. But to your point, right? I've taken apart my navigation lights when they're working fine, just to see how they come apart. Because if you're out on a 2-day cruise, and I'm not going to pull into port unless I have to, so I'm going to either in the daytime, hopefully the daytime and not nighttime, go up there and try to fix it. and knowing how it comes apart, knowing that the lens just pops off, that's important information. Knowing all that stuff helps you in those times of stress.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And
Especially if the the boat is pitching and you've got
right.
some wave action. Another thing that was interesting, I've done we've got the Scotch Bonnet Lighthouse race, which goes across Lake Ontario. It's about 80 miles, 40 miles out, 40 miles back. And I'd used a radar reflector before, and a lot of people have those Davis Echo Masters. They
Yes.
kind of, you could take them apart to have them store flat or put them together. I ended up buying, and this boat actually had one as well. Davis makes a kit that goes in between the radar reflector so the line doesn't chafe on the reflector. So that's really important. If people have a Davis Echo Master, there should be two plastic pieces. There's a piece of wire that kind of holds it together, and it tightens when it's pulled. That's a great thing to have. And the other thing that was really slick that we came up with, I didn't want the radar reflector on this trip just really bouncing back and forth and possibly abrading and chafing. So we used the prusik knot to pull the bottom of the radar reflector line to a shroud. So it really kept that radar reflector fixed, and we didn't have to worry about any chafe or the thing falling down on one of the crew members or the deck.
Yeah, and right. Very nice. That's a great tip. And putting that extra line on it to sort of pull it out keeps it from particularly under high winds, right? Some of those things that are just secured, with basically one line, boy, those lines can really start flopping around in the wind, and you add another line to it that brings it some tension in a different direction, just quiets it right down. That was a great tip.
Yeah,
Excellent.
absolutely.
Let me see. We've been chatting for almost an hour here, and Peter. And so, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners before we sign off?
Yeah. So just briefly, the Welland Canal. I'd been in the Erie Canal before, and the Welland was quite different.
And the Welland Canal goes from where to where?
So the Welland Canal will connect Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. If you're going like we were from Lake Erie, you're doing a downward passage to Lake Ontario. So the other option would be to take Niagara Falls, which you wouldn't fare so well.
Right.
There's 8 locks on that. But what's interesting with the Welland Canal, and you're interacting with big freighters, 700 feet long, will pass you, and there's spots to pull off to the side to wait. Well, unless you have extremely long lines, like 150-foot lines to tie onto these big ship bollards, there's these bolts that are probably 3/4 of an inch to an inch thick diameter that stick up maybe 3-4 inches, and you literally put the eyelet of your line, your dock line, to your cleat. So you're not being held on by much, but you secure to these areas when you're waiting for traffic to go by. Also, if you transit any of the canals, really look at they make these big black inflatable fenders that are well worth their money. We had 18 inches by 4 foot. We had 4 of these. So it really gives you some room and protection for your boat. The other thing, when you're going through the canals, especially when the locks open, you need to proceed with some momentum, because there's turbulence in the water and you can get sucked into the gates or the wall. There's actually a sailboat behind us that was getting towed, believe it or not, but he ended up getting sucked into one of the walls. And that's not unusual if you're not paying attention. And even when you're tied up waiting for a freighter to go by, you'll see, I mean, the prop wash is amazing. And if people disconnect from the wall too early, you can get sucked into there. So, really having respect for the bigger boats is important.
Very nice. Very nice. And how do you get through that canal? Do you have to make it a reservation, or is it just basically like the Erie Canal and, the canals around us, the Erie Canal and the Champlain Canal are basically on demand for the most part.
Yeah.
How does it work?
So no, you definitely need to get a reservation ahead of time. You book it, you pay in advance, and they'll say be there at 7 o'clock in the morning. We were blessed. This guy, we met up with a delivery captain, and he was kind enough. He had a 52-foot boat, so he's like, "Oh, don't worry, you'll be able to tie up with next to me." And there's a sequence. Bless you, with the Welland. You might be a port side going down, then starboard. So you need to pay attention to the canals, like the Welland. There's definite sides that you need to secure because of the line handlers. And generally, it's the same crew that will take you from point A to point B. So from lock 8 to lock 1, or from lock 1 to lock 8, they'll keep moving up or down the canal to hand you the lines. But you need to know, especially if you're doing it by yourself first time, um, to be aware of that. Read, there's guidance on there. There's also the opportunity to hire a line handler. And believe it or not, the delivery captain, he goes, I spend $300, it's well worth it. He says one guy handles both lines for the bow and stern. And, it's amazing, simple, but the way the guy had it, I mean, he did the lines like no problem. And mind you, we're rafted up to him, smooth as can be. So there again, if you're not sure, you're concerned about your boat, consider hiring a line handler, and there's resources that you can get that from the Welland Canal.
So when you're going through the canal, are you going through like, the videos I've seen of going through the Panama Canal? You're in there with a big freighter or big ship. Is it the same here?
So at least with us, the freighters were going up, and then we were getting the ride down. So
okay.
all freighters were up, pleasure boats were down. So they don't seem to be, at least in my experience, that you're in there together, but you have multiple boats. So when we went, we had 4 boats. We had a 52-foot power boat, ourselves a 47. There was a power boat, and then probably like a 35-foot power boat, and probably a 30-foot sailboat.
Yeah. Yeah. Very nice. Yeah. And the walls of the canals are concrete. So that protection and having, the fenders and good line handlers, concrete is not very forgivable.
No, not forgiving at all.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was really scary initially, so I had been, helming the boat quite a bit up to the point that we got to the Welland. But as you're pulling up to the end of a canal, I'm ready, I'm at this very expensive power boat that I'm going to tie up to, and the canal ends, or the lock ends, and you're thinking, all right, how much does this 28,000-pound boat, how long does it really take to stop and reverse? And when I go, you don't want to go so fast that if it didn't, you had an engine problem, that you crash, but you don't want to go so slow. So that was initially, it's a little intimidating, but and then we also had fog through the canal, where after we went through the first lock, that delivery captain Jason, who we tied up with, he called on the cell phone and said, you might want to turn on your navigation lights and radar because it is foggy.
Yeah.
So
now, is there also a canal that you have to go through from Lake Huron, I think it is, into Erie by Detroit there?
Yeah, there was Lake St. Clair, but there's no locks. It's just the river, St. Clair River, and then Lake St. Clair, and then we went through the Detroit River. But there's about 3 to 4 knots of current. Fortunate, all the Great Lakes funnel down to Lake Ontario out to the St. Lawrence. So we had the current with us, but if you need to stop, that could be a challenge. And it was amazing. Going through Detroit was absolutely beautiful, the skyline. But as we went through the river, ton of fishing boats. I mean, it was like, geez, do you see this guy? You know, there's smaller
Yeah.
boats. So there again, having good watch, even though it was daytime, and communication amongst the crew was important.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Well, super. Hey, Peter, this has been really great. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was so nice to get to meet you and chat with you and learn about your sailing experience and this wonderful trip. So one last question.
Sure.
Do you have any plans for the boat?
Sure. So future plans, my wife hopefully will retire at the end of this year. She's a teacher. Hopefully I'll be able to twist her arm. Like to do some cruising on Lake Ontario this summer, probably, at least 2 to 3 big trips. In a year or two, I like to go through the boat, make sure that all the systems are correct. This year I've pulled the mast. I've got some work to do with that, and all new head hoses need to be replaced. It's a 20-year-old boat. But probably in 2 to 3 years, I'd like to bring it down south, hopefully do the Bahamas. That's the goal, and see where it takes us.
Well, very nice. Well, I'd love to keep in touch and, maybe at the end of next summer, do another update on sort of what you did on the Great Lakes, because I think it's a great sailing venue that a lot of people don't know about. So this is wonderful. And it's really been a pleasure chatting with you.
You too, Bela. I appreciate it, and keep up the good work that you and Mike do.
Thank you very much.
Bela, that was great. And, it was fun to cover some slightly different ground in this episode. And it was great to get to know Peter and his sailing story. What were your big takeaways from your conversation?
Well, I think to me, the biggest one, and I often don't think about the Great Lakes, but the Great Lakes are a wonderful sailing venue. I mean, they're big. And people don't really realize how big they are. They're more like little mini oceans or seas, I guess. And they have all of the challenges of sailing out in open water. And so you have, weather challenges, you have big waves, you have commercial traffic, you got to do route planning. You can do multi-day and multi-night passages. So it's really a great venue. And one of the wonderful things about it is it's fresh water. Salt water is really tough on a boat. It's tough on equipment. It's tough on all sorts of things. So it's also, you're doing it in fresh water. So I think that it'd be interesting to get some more guests from the Great Lakes area, talk about various different experiences they've had. And I know there's a very famous race on the Great Lakes, Chicago to Mackinac.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I think it's a multi-day. You don't do it just during the daylight. You got to sail at night.
Yep.
And I know they've had some of those that, they've had some challenging weather and several boats got damaged and stuff. So like I said, it's a place that you have to respect, even though they're called lakes. They're more like the ocean when it comes to having to sail and the types of skills you need.
Yeah. 22 hours is the fastest times in the Port Huron to Mackinac race.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go.
So it's over 2 days, right? I guess, or one long day. I don't know. We should get somebody on. So listeners, if you know somebody that's done the Port Huron to Mackinac race, is there a Chicago to Mackinac one too?
Yeah.
Now I forget.
Yeah. That's the one I was thinking of. I'm thinking of Chicago to Mackinac. Yeah.
So, but I mean, this would be great. So if you know anybody who's done that, let us know and we'll try to get them as a guest, because that would be interesting. So, yeah, Bela, there were some great lessons here. And I really like the guidance on taking a boat that's new to you, right? It wasn't a brand new boat that Peter had, but a boat that's new to you out on your first long trip. Any key nuggets there that you want to emphasize here as we wrap things up?
Yeah, I think, they always talk about shakedown cruises, right? And there's a reason for it, whether it's a brand new boat, meaning fresh out of the factory, or whether it's a new to you boat, meaning it's a boat that's been owned prior to you. I think you got to check things over really carefully. And by that, I mean, not only just to check to make sure nothing's leaking and all that stuff, but you also need to sort of figure out how the various different things on a boat work. Because even though they're all sailboats and they're similar in how they work, but they're also not identical in how they work. So, and I know even for me, it's taken me a good couple of years, quite honestly, to sort of know all of the systems on the boat. And if something stops working on the boat, now I know right where to go. And when you're sailing, particularly you're doing a big transit journey, 11 days long, there are times when if something happens, you don't have time to try to scratch your head and figure out what's going on. So people make all sorts of lists, and he was really good at that. He sort of had all these checklists. He was very sort of analytical about that. And I have checklists on my boat, and there's certain things you got to know where they are. You got to know where to. There's these things on a boat called seacocks, which is basically a valve that opens up and lets water into your boat. It's used to cool your engine. It could be used for air conditioning, or could be used for your head or whatever. But my boat has like 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 seacocks on it. I know where every one of those are. Right. And right next to every one of those, I have something called a plug that if it breaks off or something, I can jam a tapered wooden thing into the hole to stop the leak, because these seacocks are like 1.5 inches, 2 inches in diameter. That's a big hole in a boat. So there's a lot of things like that. You just got to figure that out. And because you may need to react quickly. And so I think that to me was the biggest takeaway, because I think this is one of the first people we talked to that sort of bought a new boat to them and then took it on a 11-day trip. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, bold, but he thought it through, and the stuff that he learned was really fascinating. I mean, I really loved his approach to sailing in general.
Yeah,
So,
agreed.
no, yeah,
one of my old bosses told me once, and I've remembered this for years, and it's applicable here. He said, Bela, it's amazing how lucky you are when you're well prepared.
yep. Truer words have not been spoken. That's really important, I think, for sailing, right? Everything that I've seen from kind of the outside perspective is that you can solve 80% of the routine of the problems. 80% of the problems that come up are routine, and if you're methodical about it, you've got what you need on hand to take care of it. And then the 20% that are totally out of left field, still, if you're prepared and you've practiced, you can deal with it. So this is fascinating to me, how much these things like lists and having the right spare parts and having taken things apart before you need to, and all of these kind of interesting things about boats. Because at the end of the day, it's a lot going on, but it's in an enclosed, a fixed space. It's not like it's a 30-story building that you're dealing with, right? It's a relatively constrained space. Just a lot of stuff packed into that small space, it seems like.
Yeah. And you have to be sort of self-sufficient. So that's one of the skills you learn sort of when you're, when I'm sailing around the bay for 2 or 3 hours, it's not a big deal. But if you're going on a multi-day trip, you have to figure out how to be self-sufficient.
Yeah. You're a long way from the boat store,
That's right. That's right. So what do you think, Mike? Time to wrap this one up?
Yeah, this was great. And thanks to Peter for the interview. Listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. And we hope you found the conversation interesting and thought-provoking as we did. If you've got questions about what we've discussed, or you know somebody who's done one of the Great Lakes long-haul sailing races, please get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
Hey, and if you enjoy the podcast, help spread the word, and tell your friends and acquaintances and fellow sailors to give us a listen. So that's it for today's episode. I hope to see you out there next spring when the boat goes back in the water. So until next time, signing off from upstate New York. See you soon.
And from over here in Münster, Germany, thanks for listening, and see everybody next time.